how we would want to behave and if we were advocates, which we will be, and how we would attempt to be able to get ourselves into the mindset of what it must be like to be a legislator, which is particularly what we have to do if we want to understand how to be successful. Because no one's going to help us out just because they like us. We're going to have to fit the goals of other people, particularly the goals of the legislatures and legislators, if we want to be successful as advocates. So most of this is drawn from Levine. Be a couple of different clips here, Levine chapter 2 and chapter 4. So when we talk about the lobbying environment, we're going to focus in on Congress because that's really where Levine's chapters are talking about. So if we think about the lobbying environment, we have to understand the mentalities of members of Congress and their staffs, right? We have to understand what they want to get out of the legislative process, what their goals as individuals are, and really we have to understand what they want in order that we can give it to them, right? Because again, we're asking them to do something for us, and we have to understand what they get out of it as well. Second thing is, and this is very important, that we develop relationships based on individual personalities, goals, and the work environment, right? So when we focus on this, really as an advocate, it's a long-term development of developing relationships with members of Congress and their staffs as well. And that basically means that we always provide honest information, we try to get to know them, we give them useful information from their standpoint, things that help them understand their districts. And if we have this long-term relationship, that will allow us to gain access later on. As you develop the relationship, they learn to trust you, learn to understand that you have your interests of your organization at heart, but also they can get something useful out of you as well. And then the last thing is, and this is one thing that we want to focus heavily on in advocacy projects, is that we cater our style and message to an individual member or their staff, right? We have to understand what makes this person tick. What issues are important to them? What do they hope to accomplish in their career? What is their ideological predisposition? How do they use their time while they're in Congress? And we then have to cater our message to something that will help them accomplish their goals and something that's meaningful for them. So, you can't just have a template that you just go out and give to everybody. You have to tailor your message to make it effective for each individual. Now, Levine gives us 6 categories of the legislative environment to help us understand what's going on here in Congress. So the number one thing is that people are very busy. You might oftentimes hear people say, well, Congress is only in session Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and then they go back to their districts and they go to sleep for the rest of the time. Well, that's not really true. Oftentimes on Mondays and Fridays there are additional committee meetings. Even when people do go back to their states or their districts, they spend most of the time back there meeting with constituents as well. It's really a 7-day work week for most members of Congress, and they're bombarded by an influx of a lot of people that want them, a lot of people that are trying to jockey to get votes from them. So we have to understand that they're busy. Let's do it as quickly as possible, get in, get out, give them the information that they need without taking too much of their time. Another thing is that they're pulled in many directions, right? So there are many different interests from a district that want their member of Congress to do something for them. Their political party pulls them in different directions. Their committee affiliations pull them in different directions. They have meetings not only with their political party, but with their state delegations. So, in any given point in time, your member of Congress is not only dealing with all that kind of stuff, but also kind of dealing with separate staffs. So they have staff both back in their district or their states. They got staff on Capitol Hill in their own offices. And then they've also got staff in their committees and subcommittees. So they're being pulled in many different directions. We have to understand that. Another thing that's kind of hard for us to understand, I think, is that they always want more information, right? They have goals that they want to accomplish. The more information that they have that will help them to make a good decision from their standpoint, the better off that they are, right? They don't like to kind of work in an environment of uncertainty. The more information we can provide to them that's helpful, the better off we are in trying to push our case. And this is something that we talk about very heavily in any type of political science course. They are re-election aware. Everything that they focus on is trying to get re-elected. What can happen to me if I do this vote? Will it hurt my re-election chances? And that gets right to the next thing. They're defensive. And the great quote here from Levine is, "It's almost as if I can see their eyeballs starting to spin like slot machine windows as they run through the political fallout possibilities," right? And this is a great quote because, again, if you are concerned about re-election, you're concerned about your reputation, oftentimes you're going to ask yourself, should I vote the way this advocate is asking me to vote, and what are the consequences of it? And then finally, they're very peer sensitive, right? So the other members of Congress and their reputations within Congress is very important, and they don't want to lose the reputations that they've actually kind of already had. So, Bauer, Poole, and Dexter is kind of a classic study of Congress, and they focus in on what it is that members of Congress are interested in, their professional focuses, or foci, I guess you could say, of members of Congress. And the first thing is programmatic. Right? So some members of Congress are really interested in kind of becoming what we would call a policy entrepreneur in a specific area. So, a couple quotes here. He can make a reputation for himself in the field of legislation, or he can seek a reputation as a national leader. These people are really trying to pick up one issue area, say for example, higher education, and they become the kind of expert in that field and gain a reputation for that. Second thing is, you can kind of want to be somebody that's got some status on Capitol Hill, right? So a couple of quotes again here. He can work at press relations, creating and stimulating stories and an image of activity. He can conduct investigations and set himself up as a defender of public morals, right? So you create this kind of persona for yourself of what type of member of Congress that you want to be. And a third way that some members of Congress kind of focus on themselves and their professional focus is really just not worrying so much about being a show horse in Washington and a policy entrepreneur or somebody who's in the public eye all the time, but somebody who's really concerned about their district. And that essentially is just basically making sure that your constituents are taken care of and helping out there. So, for example, a couple quotes here, he can become a promoter of certain local industries. He can be a local civic leader, attending and speaking at community functions. And he can get people jobs and do social work and favors, right? So, when we look at this, each individual member has different professional focuses. Now, not all three of these are mutually exclusive. I would say in most cases you'll have some mix of them for individual members of Congress. But, different members have different areas that they focus on. And the final thing is, can be a party wheelhorse. He can befriend moneyed interests to assure himself of a well-financed campaign. He can befriend labor unions, veterans organizations, or other groups with a numerous clientele and many votes. So, your focus is essentially, this is often the case when you're in a very tight district, which could go either way, kind of a swing district. You focus on being a politician, right? Now, there are a couple of different things that we want to take a look at, and this applies mostly to Congress here, and the differences between the House and the Senate, right? And the rules and the makeup of the House and the Senate really can affect the way that we want to approach our lobbying style here. So just knowing a couple of the rules here is important. In the House, given the fact that you have 435 members of the House of Representatives, there's a lot more structure to the way that the House of Representatives is organized. Otherwise, you'd have complete chaos. So there are very strict rules for the way that things are debated on the floor. These are rules that are voted on by members of the House of Representatives. And these procedures are dominated by the majority party, right? There's more power given to committees in the House of Representatives. Again, they divvy up their work activities more so than in the Senate. And then finally, you have more access to members of the House of Representatives, obviously because there's 435 of them versus only 100 senators. So if you think about it, Bob Brady, for example, who represents Philadelphia and kind of this area, represents about 750,000 people, whereby our two U.S. senators, Pat Toomey and Bob Casey Jr., represented about 12 million people. So it's not too difficult to understand that it would be a lot easier to get access to Bob Brady than it would be to one of our U.S. senators. Now, the Senate operates with very different kind of procedures. Where the House is very rule-bound, the Senate is, if anything, somewhat chaotic. And that's because of the idea that the Senate operates under what we can call unanimous consent. And that means that in order to be able to limit debate or set up rules for how long we're going to debate things, basically all 100 members of the United States Senate have to agree to that. Now, obviously, there's got to be some ways around this, or else you might potentially never get anything done. If you can get 60 votes, you can shut off debate, and that would end what we call a filibuster. But suffice it to say that in the Senate, in the floor procedures, is that it operates in a much more chaotic way in which the minority party has a lot more influence over what happens than in the House, which is, far more kind of geared towards the majority party. Unlike the kind of committee structure that's in the House, the Senate does have its committees, but they are not as powerful in the U.S. Senate as they are in the House. And then finally, as I just mentioned, you have less access to our senators than we would to our members of the House of Representatives. Now, one thing that we want to focus in on is that the staff is very important for members of Congress, right? They don't have the time or the ability to be able to answer every concern of their constituents. They don't have time to research every problem before them. They rely on their staff to do this, to help them schedule things and various other things. So when we focus on this, we can take a look at the idea of personal staff versus committee staff. Personal staff are those people who work in your Washington office or your district office, and their goal essentially is to help constituents and help to do some research on your issues. So you'd have a legislative director or a chief of staff. You'd have a couple of legislative assistants that would be focused on specific areas of public policy for you. You'd have an administrative assistant, you have some interns, you have a scheduler. And then back in the districts, you have people that help when people walk in and have problems with, say, Social Security, other things like that. Committee staffs are a bit different. So let's just say I was on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. Those people would be experts in understanding the way that legislation is made in reference to transportation policy. And in most cases, these people have been lawyers, the people that understand the technical drafting of pieces of legislation, the people that have been around for quite a while. So they tend to be a different type of staff, more experienced and more professional, and by that, not that they are far more intelligent than the rest of the staff, but they're more geared toward legalistic type things than just kind of constituent service. But suffice it to say that oftentimes as advocates we'll go in and we may end up meeting with the staff instead of a member of Congress because of the fact that so many different issues pull people one way or the other. They don't have time to meet with everyone. Meeting with a staff is not kind of a slap in the face. It's something that happens all the time, right? And oftentimes you may be able to make your point better with them than you would a member of Congress. So where do we want to lobby? Well, certainly one of the best places to start would be in those committees because they are areas that are all the kind of issue areas are divvied up among different issues in Congress. There's a great division of labor and people specialize in different areas. So again, taking a look at our Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, if we are interested in building more roads or in mass transit or something like that, they are the people to go to. We obviously wouldn't go to the Agricultural Committee or the Science Committee or something like that. We want to find the correct committee, and then we want to go there and advocate and build relationships with them. And the two most important people are the chair of the committee, because the chair really kind of holds on to the agenda of a committee, and then what we call the ranking member, which is the minority member. So in a Congress which is dominated by Republicans right now, the chairs of all your committees will be Republicans, and the ranking minority member will all be Democrats. Those are the people that we want to focus on. And one thing to be cognizant of is that staff is very important in negotiating kind of deals among various players. And they're very integral to writing pieces of legislation. They understand the technical details. Members of Congress kind of guide them, but oftentimes it's staff that actually write up the details of the legislation. So it's very important to have relationships with the staff as well. And one interesting thing here is that we oftentimes hear that lobbyists write the legislation. Now technically nobody can introduce a piece of legislation into Congress except for a member of Congress, either in the Senate. A senator is the only person that can introduce a piece of legislation. In the House, only a member of the House. But what advocates can do is work with members of the staff in writing and rewriting legislation to their benefit. Here are a couple of examples from Levine that I think are fairly interesting. So Levine is having a little conversation here with a committee counsel, basically the lawyer for the committee. And Levine says, did lobbyists provide helpful language? And the counsel says, often, but not always. If I remember, the trade associations and large law firms were very good. If you agreed with their position, you could often take their language almost word for word. Others weren't that good. Levine, why do you think that was? The difference, I mean. Counsel, I think the associations and law firms hire a lot of ex-legislative people. Most of them had drafted plenty of legislation before. They knew how to do it. Levine, did that affect your overall impression of them? Counsel, absolutely. All right. So, one of the things that we see is that people that have worked on these committees before know the technical details. They can assist members of the committee in accomplishing their goals. So it's important to note that as well.